Hi friends, today I'm going to read with you on the second part of How Would You Worship God? The Day of Preparation. Sometimes it's good for us just to listen to our reading and not be the one that's reading so we can actually understand what is being read. So today's a good day. I'm going to read your reading assignment for you and you're going to have your book out and you're going to follow along as I read. So let's start on page 82. The Day of Preparation. Friday was called the Day of Preparation. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the women began to prepare the food for the Sabbath because no cooking could be done after the sun went down. The men did all the chores that needed to be done so that they could rest the next day. Everyone washed and dressed in their best clothes. A special Sabbath lamp was lit when the sun went down, and the family ate their Sabbath dinner. The food might be cold, but it was the best meal of the week. Early Saturday morning, the whole family went to the synagogue. That's the church. The men would be sure to wash their hands and feet before they entered the building. There were places with water near the synagogue where a man could do this, and there might even be a place nearby to take a bath. As you walked into the synagogue, you would see on both sides of the room sets of long stone benches that looked like wide staircases. If you sat on the top bench, you could see everything in the synagogue. At the far end was a carved chest called an ark, which held the rolled up scrolls of the Old Testament scriptures. A lamp, which was always lit, hung above it. There were many lamps and candles in the room. A candlestick with 7 branches could always be found in a Jewish synagogue. This ark, friends, that they're talking about is the Ark of the Covenant. We talked about that in one of our Bible lessons. And it's from the Old Testament, and the ark held the stone tablets, do you remember, of the 10 commandments that God gave to Moses. He kept them in there, and he kept the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so remember, he kept those safe inside of the Ark of the Covenant, and the men, lots of men and soldiers carried that ark to its special place. So the Sabbath was like their church day. It was on Saturday, and they would go to the synagogue, which was their church, and had special things going on that day. In the middle of the synagogue was a raised platform. On top of that was a pulpit. The reader of the scriptures would lay the scrolls there while he read. Every week in the synagogue, the Old Testament was read. After several men took turns reading, a man who had been chosen that week would explain the meaning of the scriptures. There would also be many prayers and blessings. The service ended just before lunchtime. Your family would celebrate many holidays and feasts every year. There was a celebration every single month when a new moon appeared in the night sky. Bonfires were lit on the hilltops to let everyone know when the moon was first seen. The 3 most important feasts or holidays were the Feast of Tabernacles, Passover, and the Feast of Pentecost. If you lived close to Jerusalem, your whole family might go there for all 3 feasts because the temple of the Jews was there. Tabernacle means dwelling place. The Feast of Tabernacles was celebrated to remind the Jewish people that their ancestors lived in tents in the desert. It was a happy time for all. Your family would build a booth outside, perhaps in the garden. The booth would be made of a stick frame covered with leafy branches. Everyone in the family would camp out there for a week. That's the Feast of the Tabernacles. The Feast of the Tabernacles was celebrated in the fall after all the figs, grapes, and olives had been harvested. Thanks was given to God, and the people prayed for enough rain to fall in the coming year. During the feast week, those who came to the temple to worship, including children, carried branches of palm and other trees, and waved them during the singing of the psalms. Passover was another time for remembering the past. The first Passover was in Egypt, where God's people were slaves. God had promised to free them and bring them to a land of their own, Israel, but the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, would not let them go. Do you remember this story, friends? This is the story we talked about where we watched Prince of Egypt. This is Moses and Ramesses, the Pharaoh, and Moses was chosen by God to free the Egyptian people, or to free the Israelites from the Egyptian people. And there was a time, do you remember, Passover, where they had to sacrifice a lamb and take the lamb's blood and put it on their door frame, and that meant they were Israelites, and God would pass over them, and they would live instead of being killed. The firstborn would live instead of being killed. This is what God did. He told Moses to tell his people to put the blood of a perfect male lamb on the doorposts of their house, then to roast the lamb and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Later that night, the Lord passed over all the homes in Egypt. He passed over the houses with blood on the doorposts, but inside the houses without the blood, the firstborn child died. The Pharaoh then let God's people go. The Passover feast was held every year in April. Everyone who could went to Jerusalem for the week of Passover. Pentecost, also called the Feast of Weeks, was always held 50 days after Passover. The Pentecost celebration was held when all the barley and wheat had been harvested. No one worked on the day of celebration. 2 special loaves of new wheat bread were given to God at the temple. The men brought offerings of the best grain from their crops to thank the Lord for his goodness. So here are the questions that are at the end. And it says, number 1, name the Jewish day of worship. It's called the Sabbath, or it's actually on a Saturday, which is different than how we worship right now, because we usually go on Sundays. Now, some of us go on Saturdays, and that's good too. Sabbath is more about worshiping God than on the day of the week. Number 2, why do the Jews celebrate Passover? They celebrate Passover, remember, because of Moses and his freeing the Israelites, to remember how God set them free from the Egyptians. And number 3, what feast was held 50 days after Passover, and it was called Pentecost? So that's your reading for today, friends. I am so glad to learn about how it was when Jesus lived, but I'm even more thankful for how God has brought us through a lot of trying times, and things are different now. We worship in some ways. We offer things to God like our money and our service, and even some of our resources like food and water when people need it. But things are different too. We don't have to wear certain clothes to church. There aren't rules on who can come to church. Men, women, children, babies, everyone can come to church. So I'm thankful to learn about how Jesus went to church, and the people during his time went to church and how they worshiped. But I'm even more thankful for how we're allowed to worship now too. All right, friends, I'll talk to you later.